I would like to thank first Greg Adams, who's on my board, for helping make this speaking event possible. So, Greg, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'd like to also thank the student volunteers for greeting people. And remember, there's an incentive for getting a lot of good questions. Okay, it'll either be coffee or money. I'm not sure which. All right. So good evening. My name is David Iglesias. I'm the director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Let me first give you 3 or 4 descriptions. Christian, governor, mayor, business person, faith, politics, and economics. A perfect fit for my center. First, his accomplishments. Married 37 years to Chrissy, 3 children, including a son, Brian, class of 2007, 9 grandkids. So these are significant accomplishments, and now political accomplishments. And these are mouthwatering. Under his tenure as a 2-term governor in the great state of Tennessee, the high school graduation rates were at an all-time high. Under his initiative, the Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Reconnect program, Tennessee was the first state in America to offer high school graduates and adults 2 years of community or technical college free of tuition and mandatory fees. Next bullet. Approximately 450,000 private sector jobs were created during his years in office. The unemployment rate reached the lowest level in state history. Tennessee was ranked number 1, not for football, I'm sad to say, but for advanced industry job growth. It gets better. Under his leadership, the largest tax cut in Tennessee history was passed. State government was shrunk by 7%. The budget was balanced every year, and Tennessee had the lowest debt in the country. That, ladies and gentlemen, does not happen by accident. That happens through sustained leadership. And finally, for only the second time in state history, Tennessee was awarded the AAA bond rating. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bill Haslam. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Appreciate it.
I feel like I should start out by saying my friend Greg Adams told me when I came up that Carrie Underwood is actually playing at the United Center. So if you came tonight because you heard there was a Tennessean who was performing and you got confused, it's okay. I'm actually a little used to that. I one time got on the airplane flying out of Nashville. I had to fly to the West Coast. Southwest Airlines, if you fly Southwest, you take a number and you board by number, but somehow when you're governor, your number's always 1. And so I got on the plane, I'm sitting there, the whole empty plane, this woman comes on, empty plane, she comes and sits right next to me. She goes, I can't believe I get to sit next to the governor. I go, uh-huh. She goes, for a 3.5-hour flight. I go, uh-huh. And so she's like, let's take a selfie. And so she does that, and then she says, oh, can we call my husband? He'll think it's so cool. And so we talked to her husband. She goes, how about my office? I'd like to FaceTime my office. And so we're doing all this, and people are still just boarding. And then all of a sudden I hear everybody's phones that click, click, click. And people taking pictures. And I look out there and down the aisle. This is Nashville. So if you're a country music fan at all, the 4 lead singers for the group Little Big Town are all walking down. Somebody's clapping out there, thanks. Are all walking down the aisle. And all this, and this woman who had been so she goes, well, now I don't feel like I got such a good seat. So if you thought you were coming to Carrie Underwood, I'm sorry, and we'll do our best.
Yeah, and I'm not related to Julio Iglesias, so we don't. just to carry on that metaphor. Hey, folks, so we're going to use Slido. I'm not sure whether you've ever used Slido before. So it's an online cloud questioning app. I'm sure all my students have used it for years. I just found out about it a year ago. These cards have the Slido information for you to text your questions in. So after I ask the governor some questions, I will read the best questions, the most commonly asked questions of yours. And also,
So if your question doesn't get asked, do you feel like my question wasn't the best question, or how does this work?
well, they don't, it's all anonymous.
Okay.
So, so we're also going to bring Dr. David Young here on the 21st of November, so I hope you all can come. He's a Watergate survivor, a Wheaton grad. He worked for Henry Kissinger, and he started Oxford Analytica. So this fall, we've got the best governor in Tennessee history and a Watergate survivor who's a Wheaton grad. So it doesn't get much better than that, folks. So I just want to kind of start off a little bit personal, Governor. Tell us a little bit about your background and how did you come to faith in Christ, for example?
Yeah, so grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, older brother and sister, and intact family, and probably the two most significant events of my early life all happened within about a 3-week period. This is in 1974. I'm a junior in high school and went to a Young Life weekend camp, and for the first time ever clearly heard the gospel, and the presentation and the speaker said, Jesus' claims are too bold and too dramatic to not decide about. So you should either decide, yes, he's who he said he was and I'll follow him, or he's not and I won't, but I'm not going to kind of pretend somewhere in the middle. And so I decided the best I could to begin following him. The other significant event was 2 weeks later. I'm at school and get a call in the middle of class, and the school guidance counselor says you need to go home. And my mother, who's a very young 42, has laid down to take a nap and didn't wake up. It had an aortic aneurysm and died. So I think those were the two shaping events of my early life, and they both happened to be in about a 12-day period.
Oh my, wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I've read your bio, and you started off in business. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, so I actually didn't think I was. I went to undergrad at Emory University, was a history major, and my intention was to become a pastor. I actually thought I was going to, my plan at the time was to teach high school for a couple of years and then to actually come up here and go to Trinity up in Deerfield. And my father said, if you're thinking you're going to be a pastor, you ought to come in business for a little while and get a feel for what that's like. Then when you're in a church, you'll be able to identify a little better. You already know what the high school life is like. So being a teacher won't add anything there. Why don't you come in business? So I thought, okay, I'll do that for 2 years. In the process, I kind of figured out that I really wasn't called to be a pastor. I got real involved with our church, and I loved it, but I figured out after a while that wasn't the right role for me. And so I kind of kept staying in business for a little while longer, thinking I was like, but I always had this kind of temporary picture of being there. But I loved it, and the company was growing. We grew from kind of a small regional company to being a national company. We were kind of doubling every 2-3 years, and so it was exciting and challenging. But I kind of came with that mindset of I'm going to be here for 2 years, and 2 years turned into 20.
And is that the Flying J that I see?
Pilot and Flying J, two
Pilot
different
and
companies.
Flying J, yeah. So as you drive across the interstates of America and you see that's a company that Greg and his family, that the governor and the family built. So I'm sure you would agree with me that being a Christian in any occupation is not easy. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about some tensions that you've experienced personally in the business world and your faith, when those two were in collision or tension with each other.
Yeah, my view is there's a lot of different places you can go and serve, and the question is, can you be a faithful presence in whatever that is that you've gone to? And I think the challenge, really, regardless of whatever, it always starts, I think, with time. Because the issue is always going to be if you're into what you're doing and you're applying yourself there, all of a sudden you have the whole work-life balance and challenge with raising, being, in my case, being married and having, at the time, 3 young children. So I'd say that was the first tension spot. The second is always, I think sometimes the hard, like clear-cut ethical decisions don't happen as often as in business as it looks like they do it does in the movies or books. Mm-hmm. But there's always more subtle tensions. Mm-hmm. And I think learning, particularly with that, I think at the end of the day, it's always about relationships. And as a young person, particularly if you have people working for you, learning how to do that in a faithful way. And so when I look back at like what would I like to do different, it's not so much about these big black and white ethical decisions. It was about how do I learn to treat people in a way that leads more like Jesus.
So, and I'm sure during the course of your time in the business world, you experienced some loss, maybe a setback, something you didn't expect, a challenge you didn't expect. How did you deal with that? Because I know that you can't always win, even though you might have a lot of advantages. Sometimes things just don't work out right. So, how do you handle that as a business person and as a Christian?
Yeah, and again, I think the issues there aren't any different in business that they would be in a lot of other places. I think for me, when I think about that, something that didn't work out, my father started our company, and unlike a lot of founders kind of keep control of themselves, and they won't ever hand it off to anybody else. My dad was just the opposite. I had a brother that was working with it. He probably gave us too much responsibility too early, and I probably made some mistakes, like I said, having more responsibility than I had earned probably at that point. But I think maybe one of the hardest things is we're still great friends. We've been great friends all along, but kind of hope that my brother and I would learn how to be an effective partners together. And we never really, in the 20 years that we worked together, figured out how to do that. A whole lot of different reasons. And there's not a good guy and a bad guy in it. Like I said, we were good friends then. We're better friends today. But I think if you said, do you have a disappointment, that would be it. And, I think in terms of how you learn to handle that, ultimately the answer is about, kind of what are you putting your hope in? Right. And what ultimately is the most important to you. And it's also one of those things, it's a lot easier to say that now than it was at the time.
Well, sure, absolutely. Well, I want to give a shout out to my Faith in the Marketplace mentorship class. So thank you all for coming. These are primarily business and econ international relations students here at Wheaton who are thinking seriously about going into the business world. So I'm wondering if you could give them some advice. So what are some things to be encouraged about going into the business world, and what are some things to be cautious about?
Yeah, there's a lot to be encouraged about. At the end of the day, if you can provide an environment where people can come do productive, meaningful work and provide employment in that way, that's an incredible way to serve. He'll be mad at me, but a guy I grew up with, Steve Davis, is over here. We literally grew up together in Knoxville. He has a business 5 minutes from here. And we were literally just with 120 employees. We were literally talking about that. The ability to change people's lives by providing good, meaningful work, it's kind of hard to think of something else that serves as well as that does. And so if you're thinking that way, I'd always encourage you, don't ever think of that as a lesser than employee or lesser than calling. I'm sorry. And if you're, my roommate's going off to do missions work on the other side of the world, or he's going to plant a church, or she's going to do this. All that's different callings are different callings. And I think being called to the marketplace, in my mind, is a great way to serve and a great way, again, back to my faithful presence term. And I can give you scores of examples. Like I said, Steve just happens to be one of them.
So you served many years in business and then years as the elected mayor of Knoxville, and then 2 terms as governor. So did you ever experience a call in the Christian sense of the word to going into politics or government?
Yeah, so I actually never ever thought I would run for office. I had I thought I'd always been involved politically, helped other people, but I never thought I would run. And a friend of mine named Bob Corker, Bob ended up running, being a United States Senator and chairing the Foreign Relations, but I'd known him for 30 years, and he ran for mayor of Chattanooga. And I was like, Bob, who would ever want to be a mayor? That makes zero sense to me. And then in God's providence, we ended up on spring break together separately. I didn't even know he was there. We happened to be staying near them. We both had middle school children at the time, and ran into him and said, hey, let's go on a bike ride. We're both big bike riders. And somehow I left on that bike ride thinking I would never, ever run for mayor. And 20 miles later, I got back thinking, well, maybe I'll run for mayor. And he really said, hey, have you been involved in this, agency and leading this social service group, et cetera? And I said, yes. And he goes, you can change way more lives being a mayor than you can any of those other things. Just because the power of government to leverage things. And that government really is about providing service to people. And it's one of the things I want to make sure we talk about tonight. If you're a student, you probably think, when you think about political science, you're thinking about, okay, where are you on gay marriage, and where are you on abortion, and where are you on, tax policy? But at the end of the day, government's about providing services that people can't provide for themselves, okay? It's about interstate highways and prison systems and health departments and, sanitation pickup and all the different things we do. And so you learn given the power of what government does, again, I hate to keep using the word leverage, but it's the best one. It really is a way to touch a lot of people's lives. And if you grew up, middle class or above, you probably don't think about all the places that government interacts with people's lives. But the lower your economic status, the more you do interact with government and the more you see that delivering great service is really, really important. So anyway, somewhere on that bike ride, I think I heard the first stirrings of a call. And I'll say this, having run for office, once I did that, I thought, I've never felt anywhere that felt as much like a calling as I have being mayor and governor, in the sense of, okay, I get it. This kind of feels like what I was made to do.
You didn't see a burning bush on that bike?
No.
All right.
No.
So
I had a burning throat from being tired because he was in better shape than I was. But
yeah. So maybe one of these days we can find out what that bike path was. So maybe some of these students can follow you
I can take them there.
Do you think, though, that some people are called to go into politics in a more specific way than perhaps you were?
I would encourage you to think of, politics as vocation, as calling. I can't get the quote exactly right, but John Calvin basically said that politics is the noblest and highest calling there is, and Calvin obviously would have an opinion on things like that. But I do think you should think of that, and I'd say it for a couple reasons. One, this whole idea of what a way to serve folks, and second, for yourself. I haven't been changed by anything in terms of the whole idea of Christian formation of, until Christ is formed in you. I haven't been formed by anything as much as I was by running for office and being in public office. David Axelrod, who was Obama's political guy, Axelrod had a saying that running for office is like an X-ray of the soul, and it's true. When you're in public office, it's like, everything kind of gets laid bare, and you see your own brokenness and your own potential maybe clearer than you do anything else. So I really do, if you're trying to think, well, what are the different ways I might serve? I hope you would think of that. And in today's world where we've kind of grown discouraged around politics and we see Washington and kind of throw our hands up, I'd encourage you to not think that way. That again, I'll go back to Calvin, and it is one of the highest and most noble callings.
That's great. So both as a businessman and as an elected official, you had to make a lot of decisions. Some were easy, some were hard. Can you just tell us some of your hardest decisions, both in the business world and in the government world?
Yeah, I'm going to start with government. I'll give you 2 or 3 kind of. I'll try not to take too long, but it kind of gives you a sense. I'm betting one of these, some of y'all might have even heard about it. Does the name Centoya Brown mean anything to anybody? Anybody send me an email on that one? Yeah, Brian does some of these. So here's the situation. Centoya grew up in actually just north of Nashville, a town called Clarksville. Through a variety of life circumstances, ends up on the streets, basically as a 13-year-old, in and out of the juvenile system. At the age of 16, she's working basically on the streets as a prostitute, gets picked up by a guy. Centoya is a biracial child of adoptive black parents. She gets picked up by Wheaton, 43-year-old, so I might be off on the age, and goes back to his house, and she shoots him and kills him. She ends up being tried even though she's 16, she's tried as an adult, and she gets sentenced to life in prison. life in prison means she won't, as a 16-year-old, means she won't be eligible for parole for basically 52 years, I think it is. Okay, so you're going to go from 16 to 68. All right, Centoya, by the way, never disputes that she murdered the guy. The circumstances are a little bit in doubt. Her case, somebody does a documentary of her called Me Facing Life, Centoya's story. And her case kind of goes viral, and people like Rihanna and Beyonce and Snoop Dogg and LeBron James and other people who have a lot more Twitter followers than I do pick up her case. And Greg Adams, who's here with us, he was the chief operating officer of the state when we were there, can tell you we were bombarded with emails and calls and tweets, et cetera, all around the Centoya case, okay? I had made a really dumb decision when I was first governor that I would push off all the decisions about clemencies and pardons and commuting sentences until the last 6 months. My thinking was, by the way, the governor has incredible power on all that stuff. If the governor wants to empty all the prisons in the state in 3 hours, he or she can do that, as long as you're not taking a financial bribe for it. If you say, I want everybody out, you can. If you say, I want to take, my friend Bob, he got a DUI back in college, I want to take that off his record, anything you can do. And so I didn't want people coming up to me all the time saying, hey, can you help me out on this deal? And I said, we'll do it the last 6 months. So I pushed off all these decisions. So we had literally hundreds and hundreds of cases before us. The only difference with Centoya's was because it had gotten all this celebrity attention, it had gotten all this celebrity attention. And so you had everybody from human trafficking groups, a lot of which I'm betting some of us in the room are associated with, to folks in the interest of juvenile justice saying, like, really, are we going to sentence a 16-year-old to life in prison? To people advocating against the racial disparity that you see and that we've seen historically in sentencing. And so all of that happened. Literally one night I was speaking to a group like this, and Black Lives Matters comes in and shuts down the deal with Bullhorns and says, we're not leaving until you free Centoya. Right after that, I went to a Christian concert of a singer, Andrew Peterman. Some of you all might know Andrew. And so fairly different crowd. And everywhere I went in that group, people were saying, you need to do something about Centoya. So this wide range of effect. But there were some issues, and one of those was, like I said, the circumstances of the killing weren't as clean as some people would have liked it to have been. But even more importantly, I became aware of this. There were a lot of Centoyas out there. We had over 100 juveniles who had been sentenced to life in our prisons. I just knew about Centoya because it had gotten all this celebrity attention. And so what do? Because this one case got all this attention, do you say, I'm going to deal with that? Or do you say, well, it's not really fair that I'm going to pay attention to her case and not these other 100 plus just because they haven't gotten the celebrity attention. And so you can kind of see the push and pull. A lot of other issues wrapped up in it. So and because it was a very public decision, and because usually, like I said, there's people on both sides. There's victims advocates who are saying, don't intervene in the judicial system. A jury decided that, how are you going to intervene? So to me, that's a good example of a case that, because it was really public, it made the decision a little harder. And that's true in government in general. Some of the decisions that are easy in your business aren't as easy when it's going to be on the front page of the paper the next day. For students, papers are these things that used to come at the end of your driveway.
It was made out of stuff that looks like this.
Right. But long story short, I did decide to commute her sentence to 15 years, which was 6 months from that date. Several reasons. One, that's what I think in today's world, that's what she would be sentenced to. Number two, I think we have a different awareness of what human trafficking looks like today than we did then. It doesn't just mean somebody who's been brought here from another country. She literally was under the control of this pimp who she thought was her boyfriend. Number three, I don't think sentencing juveniles to that long. And then even most importantly is in our correction system, we hope that rehabilitation and redemption happens. And in Centoya's case, it had. There's a Christian college in Nashville called Lipscomb University, a Church of Christ school, and they have a in-prison degree program. And she had literally gotten her bachelor's with a 4.0, had changed and become a prisoner who was mentoring younger women, and her faith in Christ was real and apparent. And so it is a picture to me of like, this is what we hope happens, and society will be better with Centoya out than in. Right. But to me, that's I guess, one example of a hard one.
It sounds like you haven't lost any sleep over that decision, that looking back now, you believe that was the right decision to make.
I really do, and we've actually, it's kind of in, Chrissy and I, once we were out of office, went to visit her in prison. I had a wonderful visit, and we had dinner with her and her now new husband last week. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it wasn't, when after we were leaving, I said, Chrissy, this wasn't like somebody that used to be the governor, used to be the first lady, and somebody who used to be in prison for life. This literally was a brother and two sisters because of just the beautiful picture of the gospel that's her life. Mm-hmm. Well, let me throw out one more thing that I want to say is this. One of the things about being, I think, in jobs like this is it really does, some people say, well, is it hard to be a person of faith in those roles? It's actually, I think, easier because you see the truth of what we believe. One of the things that we believe is that we serve a God who's both holy and loving, and he figured out a way to be both just and merciful. Okay? I thought I could do that. All these cases that came before me, I thought, I can figure that out. I know how to be just and merciful at the same time. And I found out I couldn't do it. I just didn't know how to be just. You know, we all want a world where, you know, evil gets punished, that the bad guys get caught, and to be merciful. And figuring out how to do both of those I thought would be so easy, and it was so hard. And it just gave me a new appreciation for the beauty of the gospel where God figured out a way to be just and merciful at the same time.
That's beautiful. So I think right now we're at a place in American history where a lot of our fellow Americans would say it's really bad, our politics are acrimonious. I've heard people say it's the worst it's been ever, and I'm old enough to remember, like some of you all here, I remember the Vietnam era. I remember the massive protests. I remember MLK being killed and Bobby Kennedy being killed and cities burning. So it's not like that now. But I think a lot of people have given up hope. And I'm wondering, as somebody who's been on the inside of politics and now has recently left, can you give us some hope?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I understand particularly the frustration with Washington. I very, very much understand that. And I feel the same way. I feel like we're in a world where it's kind of, we've divided up into reds and blues. The country's pretty evenly divided. I don't know. I mean, we don't know how this next election's going to go, but I bet it'll be close one way or the other. The last 8 elections in a row have been decided by single digits. We've never gone that long with races being decided by single digits. I'm willing to bet this next one will be decided by single digits regardless of everything else happening. And we're just evenly divided and we're mad about it. Mm-hmm. And here's what I hope you'll learn to appreciate is, those of you who are older remember Eisenhower talked about, he warned us against a military-industrial complex. People who, there was a big industry around making money off of the military industry. Today, there's an outrage industrial complex. There's a lot of people that make money off of being mad about politics. And so you can tune into choose your cable network, and you'll hear one story and you'll think, great, somebody that thinks just like I do. And then you'll turn on the other one and you'll go, what are they talking about? And what's happening is we're all looking at the news not for information, but for ammunition. Somebody that thinks like I do that will give me ammunition in all this. And so I'm hoping we'll be the people that change that. We'll be the people that understand this. As believers, we probably theologically in this room, we probably disagree about some things, but hopefully at the root of all that, we all understand our own brokenness, this kind of common trait we have of sinfulness. And so I hope that leaves you saying, I understand that with me, so that means this. It means I could be wrong. My political mentor was a guy named Howard Baker. He was a United States Senator, became majority leader. He ended up being Reagan's chief of staff, was ambassador to Japan. And Baker had a saying that said, he was from a little country town north of Knoxville. And he had a saying that said, always remember the other fella might be right. And as believers, that's what we should be that way, right? Because we know, like, I get a lot of things wrong. Matter of fact, I'm kind of thinking if I get it right 51% of the time, I'm doing okay. And so I think we should be those people that are bringing back kind of hope. And then the other thing I'd say this is, I say this with some hesitance because I realize I'm in Illinois, but don't give up on your state and local governments. I realize that's a little dangerous, but there are so many good things happening state and locally. I mean, I could take you around towns and states all over the country that are providing just vital services and solving problems. And so I'd say, what do you say to people like us who are going discouraged? I'd say, start with kind of your own brokenness. And then number two, be about bringing in people who will solve problems. It's wonderful to have people who think just like you do, but if they're not committed to solving problems, then you probably should find somebody else, because at the end of the day, you elect people to solve problems.
So looking back at your 8 years as the governor of Tennessee, how would you rank your top 3 accomplishments in terms of how it affected your fellow Tennessean? What were the top 3 things?
Yeah, so I think the thing we'll get the most notice for is what you talked about. We were the first state to have 2 years free of community college and technical school. And some of you might go, well, I thought you were a Republican. That sounds like a Bernie Sanders idea. I don't get it. Here's what I would argue to, and I had some people on my side of the aisle say, what are you doing that for? Here's what I'd argue is, regardless of your politics, you have to admit that income inequality is an issue in our country, okay? That's not a political statement. That's just a data-driven statement. It just is, okay? And it's getting worse. And I think there's a lot of solutions. There's a lot of proposed solutions to that. A lot of them come around like, well, let's just redistribute wealth. Well, when I see some of the proposals out there and say, well, we can do all these things if we'll just redistribute the wealth. Well, I don't think the math works on most of those, okay? And even if it does, by the way, we're also supposed to be concerned about people beyond our borders, and it definitely doesn't work if you start doing it internationally, where even our poorest of people in this country are relatively wealthy on a worldwide basis. I think the one thing that provides the chance to change that is access to high-quality education. And we haven't historically had that in this country. And so what we said is, in today's world where we knew a lot higher percentage of our population needed a degree or certificate, if we could provide that free, I used to be in the retail business, free gets people's attention. And if most, I don't know, maybe I'm making a bad assumption, but a lot of you grew up in families where it was assumed you'd go to college, but that's not really true of most families. And so if we change that dinner conversation to that would provide a whole new trajectory for people. So we did that, and the college attending and completion percentage of our state is slowly but surely increasing. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing was a product of that. What we learned really quick is it doesn't do you any good to give people free college if they're not prepared when they get there. Okay, what we found in Tennessee 2 years before I came, we were saying that 80% of our students were proficient at grade level. Okay, all of our students, 80% were proficient. But guess what? When they got to community college, 70% needed remedial work. Okay, no way both of those are true, right? There's no way 80% are proficient and 70% need remedial work, okay? So what happened? We had been lying to parents. We'd been saying, your child's doing fine. They're right on grade progress, okay? But I told them, it's like putting the basketball goal at 6 feet and telling, congratulations, your child can dunk. You know, that's great, but it's not real. And so we had been lying to parents. And so we raised our standards. We put a year-end evaluation in place to measure students. And then we started evaluating our teachers by how much their students were learning, which you might say, That doesn't sound all that radical, but it was a foreign concept. And I'll say this, if you're discouraged about, well, nothing ever happens, let me go back to this. We had a Republican president in George W. Bush who had a No Child Left Behind. Now, it ended up playing out where some difficulties, but the idea was a great one. Here's a Republican president saying, I'm not going to accept the idea that some kids can't learn, okay, because of where they live or the color of their skin or their economic background. I'm not going to accept that. So we're going to have standards of growth that we're going to place. We're not going to measure this inner city kid versus this suburban kid, but we're going to measure how much they grow, and then we're going to evaluate. So that was a huge step for a Republican president. Then you had a Democrat president, Obama, who did something maybe even bolder. He put in place the race to the top, which rewarded states with funds, but it did those three things. It said you got to raise your standards, number one. Number two, you got to have a year-end evaluation. And then number three, here's the big deal. You got to have the teacher's evaluation has to be tied to how much the students learn. Now, what's the problem with that politically if you're a Democrat president? The teachers' unions, who are a big base for the Democrats, don't like that. But you had a Democrat president, Obama, who I don't think has got enough credit for that. He went against his base. And I think you should look for that in your leaders sometimes. When do people go against the folks who are the most with them? Okay, there was a book called Profiles in Courage, and as they say, the joke is it's a really skinny book for a reason. But you had that in those cases, and so that was the second thing. We raised first was free college, second raised our standards so kids were prepared. The third one, you might say, well, that doesn't sound really exciting compared to free college, but we blew up our civil service system. Mm-hmm. And you go, well, okay, what's that to do? Well, those of you who aren't familiar, civil service basically says that in government there's prescribed rules for who gets hired and who gets promoted. And the biggest basis for that is who's been there the longest. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm betting in most of your businesses you don't promote by who's been breathing in place the longest, okay? And so we literally didn't recruit for jobs. We needed a new engineer for transportation or a new accountant for our finance group or a new children's services workers. We just took who was next in line. Now, if you really think we have this kind of sacred mission to serve people, you're not serving anybody well by taking who's next in line instead of hiring the very best. Mm-hmm. And I'm just one of these people who think the team with the best players wins. So those would be the three things I'd say.
So you're talking to a fellow history major who's
Yep.
not very good at numbers. It sounds like you're a lot better with numbers than I am. But how in the world do you get free education while cutting the state budget and shrinking the number of state employees?
So here's the thing.
How does that work?
Here's the thing on free education. If you're a low-income family, you just don't have access to all the tools and insight that other folks do. And so kind of it's not dirty, it's not really a secret, but the dirty little secret of our Tennessee Promise idea was it didn't cost us that much. Most of the kids who took advantage of this qualified for Pell scholarships and other grants, and we paid the last dollar of it. And so by the time they applied for everything, the gap was not that big. And so it ended up being a very affordable deal. We rearranged some of the money that was going to some other scholarship programs and made it work. And then we also did it for adults. So not just people just graduated, but if you're the 45-year-old single mother of two and you're stuck in a dead-end job, you could go back and get your whatever certificate or degree you needed. So again, it's all about figuring out a way to solve a problem. And we had a big problem in that not enough people had degrees and certificates.
Wow, that's great. So my time is nearly up, so I hope you're thinking of good questions to send via Slido, and I hope Slido is working. I haven't looked down, so yes, it is working. Hallelujah. So I have to ask you this question, because if I don't ask you this question, I'm going to fire myself
Don't do that.
as an interviewer. But you've got the perfect resume to run for Senate, and maybe beyond. But I've read that you are not going to do that, and I'm just wondering how you got to that decision point.
Well, literally, it began with, I actually had two opportunities. So one of our senators announced his retirement, so he would be leaving right when I got out of office. And then that was Bob Corker. And then our other, Lamar Alexander, announced back in December that he was going to leave at the end of this term, so at the end of 20. So I had two times to think it through. the process, well, I just say ultimately it was this. The things that I loved about being a mayor and being a governor really don't have anything to do with being a senator. We tend to think of elected offices, well, you're political, you're running for office. But if you think about the job of senator and the job of governor or mayor, they're two very, very different jobs. So that was number one. Number two, I think the things that I felt like I wanted to focus on kind of for this next, or we wanted to focus on for this next stage of life, being in Washington didn't really fit that well. But the way it practically looked out at is my wife Chrissy and I went away for a long weekend, just the two of us, and we literally got those big white sticky pads and put them on walls all over the house with pros and cons, and if we did this, what would life look like, et cetera. And one of the benefits of being married to somebody for 38 years is she knows you, as well or better than you know yourself. And Amen. She was a great part of the process. At the end, we just kind of became convinced. We changed our prayer from, God, tell us if you want to run, to it feels like we're not supposed to run, change our hearts if you do. And we kind of put a date out there, and our hearts didn't change in the meantime.
Well, that begs the question, what's next for you?
I really don't know. I have a friend of mine, Curtis, who's a good friend, just asked me that, and I honestly don't know. Right now I'm teaching a class at Vanderbilt 2 days a week. I'm doing a little speaking like this. I'm on 2 or 3 different boards and involved in a couple of business things. So I don't know if there'll be a one thing that I do next, or if life will look like a combination of things. I'm kind of waiting to see what... the amazing thing, God's kind of always been faithful in the past to bring that thing along. And maybe it's one thing and maybe it's not. But at this point in time, lots of people have kind of said, don't make a decision fast. And it's been really, really good advice.
I think I shared with you on our walk over from the Harbor House, a good Navy friend of mine was told by a retired General Colin Powell, do nothing for 6 months. Just stop, smell the flowers, plan slowly. So that's fantastic. Well, I want to thank you for answering my questions. I have a ton of Slido questions, so thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So how it works is you all vote on each other's questions.
Wow, really?
So I have 14 people support this following question. Yes. No, I don't.
With a small d.
Now I see a little bit of, that's right, I just caught that. I don't see any Cyrillic in here, so I don't think the Russians have hacked this, the Slido. Politics is the business of compromise. What sorts of political compromises are acceptable for Christians and which are not?
Yeah, by the way, that's such a great question. It really is about compromise. And, the whole saying about, he who goes for a whole loaf instead of a half rarely gets either one is true. And so a lot of time in legislation, there were things that, here's how I thought it would work. I thought this piece should work this way. But I'd get halfway into it and realize we're not going to get there. And so we would change and make those adjustments we had. I mean, every state's different, but in Tennessee, every legislature obviously votes on bills, and then the governor can veto that bill. Some states, to override that veto, it takes 2/3 of the legislative body. In Tennessee, it just takes a simple majority.
Oh my.
So if everybody who votes for it the first time just votes for, to override the veto the second time, you see where you are. So vetoes don't do you a lot of good in Tennessee. So I actually had to go in early in the process and say, sometimes the compromise wasn't so much taking something that we wanted and accepting some changes. It was something that we thought was bad, but we thought was going to pass. And we tried to make it a little less bad and say, okay, we won't veto it and go through that whole dance, but if you'll make these changes on the front end. And I guess the specific questioner was asking, though, when is a believer, when do you not compromise? Well, obviously, if you think there's something that's going against biblical principles, you're not going to compromise. You're not going to compromise in the end. Also, if you think this is just not good for the state. I mean, I held up my arm and said, I'm going to protect, defend, and not just the Constitution, but the people of this state. And if I thought at the end this is just not going to be good, then I wouldn't compromise. But I'd say those were kind of the two rules. If it was something I didn't think was violating any biblical principles, and something I thought, well, okay, it's not great, but the state's still going to be better with this than with nothing, then I would jump in.
Gotcha. So how do you maintain your Christian beliefs while also observing the separation of power, the separation of church and state, which is obviously, arguably a constitutional principle?
So I'll give you a really good example of this, and David warned me, I don't know if I want you using this one, but I'll go ahead. I actually vetoed.
I know where you're going to go.
Yeah, I actually vetoed the Bible when I was in office. So I'm waiting for the big hook to come grab me. So I'll give you a great example. Our state, remember, every state's different. Tennessee's a very conservative state. Our state passed, you know how states, you have a state song and a state tree and a state bird and a state insect. Our legislature passed a bill to make the Bible the state book. Okay, now some of you are kind of laughing at that. Some of you are going, yeah, that sounds good. And get all that. So I had an issue with that. I mean, the whole establishment calls it the government won't establish a religion. Okay? I thought that was violating it. Now, the legislators came back and said, well, no, it's just, we're recognizing it as a book that's a great piece of literature. I said, well, it's either a sacred text or it's a great piece of literature. If it's a sacred text, then I think it is establishing a religion. And so there's a case where I literally vetoed the bill to make the Bible the state book. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't think, and I'm actually working on a book on this, we're not called to keep our faith out of the public square. It's just the opposite. We are called to bring our faith right into the public square. But we also, though, I don't think you want the government establishing religion. Everywhere that's ever happened, the church has been the one that's lost. And by the way, we fought about this from the very beginning. You know, when the Puritans first came here, remember the whole, famous, we're going to be a city upon a hill that Reagan liked to quote so much. And they came with that idea, but as I did, they were escaping religious persecution. They were going to set that up. Within about a very short period, there's probably a history professor in here who could tell me the exact time, but Roger Williams was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's a Puritan minister, kicked out because he's saying, y'all are trying to make the government, our religious beliefs, our Christian faith, you're trying to make those the laws of the government, and that's what we said we weren't going to do. And so this dispute has been going on literally from the first days that we were establishing what became this country, okay? It's not a new argument. And I think that, like I said, I think the church is better if we don't try to make the state become the church. But the state is much weaker if we don't bring our beliefs into the public square. You asked about, kind of making a hard decision. Some of you all know the name William Wilberforce. I'm even willing to bet there's some people in here that Wilberforce might be your hero because he was mine. Wilberforce was a member of Parliament, elected at an early age, becomes a believer, thinks he's going to drop out of Parliament. It took John Newton, who is the guy who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, to talk him into staying, to say, you can help the cause of Christ more here than anywhere else. And he's the one who led what became a 25-year battle to abolish slavery in Great Britain, and fought the royal family and everybody else. And over a long period, he led the charge to do that. And aren't we really glad he brought his faith into the public square? If you went to Harriet Tubman of the Underground Railroad's church up in Canada, where kind of the end of the Underground Railroad, there's a thing that they bring to visitors. All the people want to see, well, where does it end? Where's the church? And that the elders of that church hand out to visitors, making it really clear that Harriet Tubman and others were motivated by their faith. That's why they were doing this. And I can go on with examples. So I tell people, you don't really want to push people of faith out of the public square. Even if you don't agree with our motives or our beliefs, you still want the change that has happened in the world because of it.
And incidentally, in case your son didn't tell you, our administration building, Blanchard, was a stop on the Underground Railroad.
I did know that. I did know
So,
that. Yep.
yeah, so we have a long, proud history here at Wheaton with our abolition founders. So, and I'm also I'm dying to know the person on the street after you vetoed the Bible bill. What kind of reaction did you get as you were walking about Tennessee?
It's kind of a hard one to explain. So, actually hard to explain to my wife. I came home that day. She goes, "Hey, how was your day?" I go, "Not so good. Vetoed the Bible today." But I still have people, really well-meaning people who really, if you're an average person, one thing you have to realize, most people, they're going on about their life and they're just barely paying attention to all this, okay? It's like, man, I got enough to do on my plate. And all they know is you vetoed the Bible. And so I'd run into people all the time, sincere, well-meaning people saying, "Well, I seem to like you and all that. You seem to be a fairly decent person, but you lost me when you vetoed the Bible." And you try to walk through the whole, but anything that takes you more than 20 seconds to explain, you're losing. So,
yeah, unfortunately, we live in a short attention span culture. So I've got a lot of questions, presumably from students asking what advice you would give them in seeking internships for careers in D.C. or any other political sphere. Yeah,
so I'd encourage you to not just say in D.C. There's lots of internships available, and I'd suggest that you start with, somebody that represents you or your district is a great place to start. I'd also encourage you to think about doing it in state government. We had a program, state government, both in the governor's office and in departments where you actually got to see this is how this stuff works. And a lot of stuff that the federal government does we actually implement. So, welfare or TANF benefits, which you might know as welfare, or SNAP benefits, which you might know as food stamps. Those are federal programs, but we're the ones that actually run those programs, okay? And I can keep going with that. So I'd encourage you to think of that. And then I'd also throw this out. We have a program, and Greg helped to run, Greg Adams, who is our chief operating officer of the state, is here, and he's on David's board, and his son, Brian, is a Wheaton student, still lives in the neighborhood. But we had a program where we actually brought in 5 graduates every year to come be governor's fellows and work throughout state government to basically expose them to how it worked. So I'd encourage you to think about lots of opportunities like that and not just think, well, I want to go work for my senator in Washington. I'd think broader.
That's really good advice. I've also served in state and local government as well, and there's a lot of good to be done there as well. So tell us a little bit about the biggest mistake you made as governor and how you dealt with that.
Well, one of those I already talked about in the terms of I put off that whole decision about pardons and clemencies and commutations until the end, and then I realized, I was just worried about playing defense, and there was a lot of places I could have gone and played offense,
right,
and I didn't have time. So that would be one of the biggest. The second would be, I sometimes hired some people for government without thinking about, because they had great backgrounds other places, and not thinking about, would the transplant work? Mm-hmm. And people can be really successful in one environment and not have the skill set to adapt to another. And there were several people that I didn't put them in a position to win, and I had to go in there and address it because, like I said, they weren't succeeding, but it was my fault, not their fault, for giving them a task that they just weren't equipped. They didn't have the right gift set to do.
Sure. I've got a question here asking about, are there other governors or legislatures, I'm going to add judges, that you admire?
There's actually a lot. There were several governors that I served with that I would choose. If I'm building a team, I'd choose them today. Republicans and Democrats, by the way. Several of my closest friends as governors were Democrat governors who we weren't on opposite ends of the spectrum, but we were at least on different halves of it. Mm-hmm. I in the process of doing all this, I met a lot of very principled people, and I know it's really easy just to kind of throw your hands up and think, all these folks are just political partisans doing it. But I actually met more people who encouraged me than discouraged me in the process.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question, probably written from some Californians in the audience. If you're the governor of California, what would you do today?
So
And you can take your time to answer that question.
Yeah, no, it's actually an interesting one. This is where different philosophies of government come into play. So California has taken a view of we're going to be a bigger government state. And fortunately, they've had the revenue to do that because of the historic growing economy. And so while they've had some dips in increases, by and large, they've had the revenue to do that. But eventually, I think you get into the problem. The difference in state governments and federal governments is this. State governments have to balance their budget. So I really appreciate when you said he balanced the budget every year, which is a great accomplishment because I'm constitutionally mandated to do that. Okay.
So you follow the Constitution.
There you go. But states have a different approach to that. So a state like Illinois is the same way, right? You've made some historical obligations that cause taxes to be higher. Now, the problem eventually you have is people can choose where they live, right? I mean, it's a little harder to move out of the country, but you can say, well, I'm going to move from Illinois to Indiana. I'm going to move from California to Arizona. And eventually, I think the bill becomes due. I think what California's unique situation is, and I'm not one of these people that just say you should deregulate everything, but California has regulated their economy so much, it's much more expensive to do business there. And so the net effect is this. I was talking to somebody the other day who I hadn't talked to him in a long time. Last time I talked to him, he said, we're going to pull all our business out of California. And I talked to him, and I said, no, we're like last month. He said, no, we're growing in California. I said, why? He goes, well, I've got this established businesses there, and their margins, because it's so hard to do business there, their margins are like twice as high as anywhere else. And so when you keep increasing regulation without it being thoughtful, you're ultimately driving up the cost of doing business. And so ultimately, I think they're going to have a problem in the sense of it's going to be hard to keep revenue coming up at their historic levels because they've got some big advantages. They have an ocean and mountains and gorgeous climate. But eventually people go, I love it, but it's not worth this. And so people can choose to move with their feet.
In fact, I know some Wheaton grads that are leaving the Bay Area just for that reason.
Yeah, and
They're just tired of it.
there's a great example. So if you want to live in the Bay Area, they have a huge housing problem.
Yeah.
So why do they have a housing problem? 2 or 3 reasons. One, demand's out the roof. That's to their credit. The whole tech industry has caused demand to go out. The second is they put a ton of regulation and restrictions about what you can build. So it's really hard to build multifamily housing there, okay? So it's kind of a not in my backyard deal. Like, I don't want that multifamily housing near me, so we're going to put zoning regulations in place. Well, the net impact is they got a major housing problem. That's a really good example of, despite this, all the great things they have happening, they have a fundamental issue because they've restricted supply so much.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I understand, and I'm sure the audience does as well, that governors don't do foreign policy. But there is a question
I've never
regarding...
been to the Ukraine.
That's right. Thank you very much. But there's a question about tariffs because currently, as you know, we're imposing tariffs on China and vice versa. What are your thoughts on tariffs?
Yeah, I'm a free trade guy. I think the world works better when we can have free trade and goods become more efficiently produced, and we work that way. That being said, we don't have a level playing field with China. Mm-hmm. The rules aren't the same going in as they are coming out. And I think we need to address that. Specifically with what the president has done on that, I would do it in a different manner. I'd probably try to figure out a little different style to do it. But I think sometime we have to make the point that this has to be a level playing ground, and it hasn't been. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, right point, wrong means.
And I think you told us over dinner that as you're teaching undergrads at Vanderbilt, not more than 10 minutes goes by and then somebody's asking you about the current administration. So we've gone almost an hour.
Amazing. It's the longest conversation I've had in the last 6 years that hasn't gone there.
But I do have to ask you this question.
Yeah.
As a currently licensed attorney, you may plead the Fifth Amendment. I just want to tell you that. But how do you feel about the current administration? What are your thoughts on the current administration?
Yeah, it is interesting. Like I said, I'm teaching a class at Vanderbilt 2 days a week on leadership, and no matter what we prepare, and there's some professors in the room, it doesn't matter what we prepare, what the topic is. Within 15 minutes, we're talking about either President Trump or the Democratic primary, one or the other, but we're there in 15 minutes every class. I mean, we can start talking about, the War of 1812, and we end up there, okay? So, what I guess the safe political answer, if I'm still in office, I'd say, well, our styles are really different, is what I'd say. But I'd say this, I do think there's a lot of things that the president has done that long-term are going to be really bad for the country. And I'll even say that as a Republican. What people don't realize about democracy is there's not a strategic plan to it. Okay, as Republicans, we don't hire McKinsey Consulting to come in and say, we've done a 10-year forecast and here's what you should do. Okay, it doesn't work that way. There are no party fathers and mothers anymore who are saying, here's what you should do. And so as a Republican, I'm concerned because I look and go, our country's becoming a lot more a country of color. Women are becoming a lot bigger political force than they were 10 years ago. We're losing big time with both of those groups. And so just as a politician who thinks, by the way, I think our ideas, I'm not arguing here, but I think our ideas are the right ideas, okay? And I look and go, but we're going to lose ground with these vital constituencies of what the country's starting to look more like with where we are now. And so that bothers me because ultimately I think here's the things that I believe to be true about government, and those people who are kind of typically on my side of the aisle, I think we're going to lose more long term than we're gaining because of where we are right now.
So because we're a higher ed institution, I'm glad there's an education question here. Are you worried that reinforcing the government's monopoly on public education will hurt competition, thus reducing the quality of the education that's provided?
Right, it's a great question. Somebody said, well, if you look at the only two things that we haven't, as a country, we've made incredible progress. Think about everything, how much better everything works from, technology to logistics, everything works better. The two areas where we really haven't made progress on outcomes and cost are education and healthcare. Okay, and both of those are areas where somebody else is paying for it. So there's not this, like I said, for all we spend in the U.S. on healthcare, our outcomes are not that great, and we spend a lot. And for public education, even though we're not spending as much as maybe we should, we're spending a lot more than we used to, and the results aren't really showing. So I think the questioner's saying, you're just enforcing a monopoly by doing that. Well, I think that's probably true. That there's some pieces of that are true. But having said that, the reality is most of the kids in our kids and adults in our country who go to education are going to go to a public school. Okay, that's just where the numbers are, and it's how it works. And so I had the decision, am I going to focus as a governor, am I going to focus on vouchers and making vouchers available to folks, or am I going to try to make as many gains as I can on raising our standards and bringing better teachers into class? And I focused on that. And I realized that people say, well, I think you made a bad trade, but I thought that's where most of our students are going to be. Public education, I think, is still the best avenue we have to addressing some of the big inequality of opportunity and issues around increased mobility that we have in the country.
How do you manage to
By the way,
cut?
government's a series of trade-offs. So whoever said, are you worried about you're going to be enforcing the monopoly? We are. And it is a monopoly. That being said, if we put the right standards in place and the right evaluations and assessments to see what students are learning, we can actually measure that.
How do you cut taxes without hurting the safety net for those people who actually need it?
Yeah, so what we try to do is, listen, there's a tremendous amount of built-in inefficiency in state government. So today in Tennessee, and again, Greg and others helped on this, we're using like 1 million square feet of real estate less than we did before. Okay?
Oh my.
So because everywhere you went, the state had an office building there.
Right.
And, oh, by the way, a lot of our folks we figured out a way they'd rather just commute from home because they had a field job anyway. Why were they why were they doing all this? So we thought of a lot of different ways like that to save money. I think then the second thing we try to do is how do we make that safety net, initially a net, but eventually a trampoline, to where, the idea would be, let's see how we can get you, we're pleased to present to use these SNAP and TANF benefits for you now, but the idea is that you wouldn't be using them in 5 years. So how are we going to get you the education and the job training so you won't be using that 5 years from now?
I see. So here's a very thoughtful question. How can Christians, either in business or politics, face competing parties in a spirit of love without consistently getting trampled upon?
It's a great question, and because I think that is our mandate today. In this world where it is so partisan and it's so passionate, like I said, not only are we divided, but we're mad about it. I'm mad about people that get their news from CNN instead of Fox, or from Fox instead of MSNBC. Pick your whatever you want to do there. And so again, I come back to that sense of we lead because we understand that we're broken people ourselves, and we might not get this always right ourselves, number one. Number two, but we're also people of truth. We believe there's such a thing as true truth that's true regardless of circumstances. And some of those folks who take a more secular view of the world, that their ultimate issue is if you don't believe there's any transcendent truth, then how are you going to fight for any rights? Where do those rights come from? But we understand there is such a thing as transcendent truth, so we can believe in rights and have a basis to back that up. And then the last thing I think that is we try to be those people that, like I said, what I said was so hard to do, that we work really hard to be just and merciful at the same time.
That sounds very hard.
It's really hard. And this last one is, fortunately everybody here doesn't have me. I used to say I'll get emails about this, but you can't write to the state's email account anymore. So, but there is a little difference in us. And by the way, I don't mean we're supposed to get trampled over, but I do think this. We serve a God who came to let the bad guys kill him, not to kill the bad guys. Okay, now his mission was really different than ours, and I don't want to, so there's some danger in that. But there is a sense of, we're not supposed to be out, our mission is not to prove that we're right. Okay, that's not what we're called to do. Our mission is to try to figure out, how do we be just and merciful at the same time and lead to better opportunities. Greg can tell you, we had up in our conference room in the governor's office, the Micah 6:8 verse, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. Those are three pretty good guidelines for what we should be doing out there. We should be doing justice. So if you think there's a policy that's a bad policy, you should be actively engaged in that. But you should also love mercy. And of all things, we should be the people who are most noted for walking humbly.
Do you believe every Christian ought to be a Republican? And do you believe that every Christian should vote the same way?
No, and no. I really don't. Listen, I think there are some issues that tend to break down on party lines that I'd say, well, I do think there's a biblical issue, but I really don't. I just think it's really dangerous if you do think that. And I know some people who are very close brothers and sisters of mine who we haven't voted for the same person for president in a long, long time, and we might not ever. And so I just don't view the world that way. And I don't know that we've helped the cause of Christ in doing that. I know a lot of people who, there's a whole lot of, you've seen all the statistics about people leaving the church, and people think, well, what is that? What's going on there? There's a lot of things going on there. But one of those is people who have been turned off by people who say, well, the church just looks like this political party, and the term evangelical, instead of meaning one who bears good news, has come to mean a certain political voting group. And that's not good for the church long term.
What are your thoughts on Common Core education?
So a little history there for those who don't know. Common Core was a something that was actually started by governors and said, here's what we think each child should know or each student should know in every grade along the way. Here's what they should know. And then the idea is we'd put in a test that was commonly taken across the country so that you could say how your third grader was doing compared to third graders on a national average instead of just in your state. That was the reason. It was actually started by a bunch of governors who said, wouldn't that be helpful? President Obama then kind of adopted it as a basis for his race to the top, and a lot of people came to see it as federal government kind of overbearing on what should be a state and local decision about curriculum and other issues. And so there was a massive pushback against it, of people saying, I think this is federal overreach, doing stuff they shouldn't, and literally the whole thing got blown up by two sides, by some right-wing Republicans who said, I don't like the federal government telling me what to do, and then by some left-leaning folks who mainly were teachers union advocates who said, I don't like the standards and that the evaluations are going to be tied to what students are learning. So you had this kind of, in my opinion, unholy alliance from the right and left coming together. The downside to that is what we lost is the ability to say that here's how my child is really doing compared to everybody else in the country. There was, I should add a caveat, there was a legitimate thing. The federal government was intruding on things that the state and local government should do. So I wish we could have done it as a combination of states instead of the federal government telling us what to do.
So I had to put on my reading glasses to understand this question. So here it is.
I might need to phone a friend then.
So here's the claim. Institutions are not bound by religious or moral obligations, but rather constitutional ethics that are a platform for individual obligations. What are your thoughts on this claim?
Wow, read it one more time.
That makes me feel better, Governor. The claim is institutions are not bound by religious or moral obligations, but rather constitutional ethics that are the platform for individual obligations. So as I understand it, the Constitution provides a framework for morality and ethics, not religious or moral obligations.
Yeah, I guess I'd say in the end, though, the Constitution doesn't address the Constitution was the framework for our country. It wasn't necessarily a set of moral guidelines. Mm-hmm. And institutions end up being made up of groups of people. So Wheaton is an institution, but it's made up by a group of people that over time express its values from, everything from obviously ultimately the board, but the faculty senate has a voice in that, and alumni and students. Mm-hmm. Somewhere, remember my son was here, so somewhere back in the 2000s, they decided we were going to lift the ban on dancing and let square dancing happen. So maybe they've gone further than that. But I mean, somewhere in there, the Constitution didn't going to tell Wheaton what they should do about dancing, okay? Wheaton itself had to decide that. And as an institution, ultimately, it's made up of a group of people who decide that.
Thank you.
Just I don't know if that answered your question or not, but it's my best.
I think so. I'm sure I'll get some emails if I got that wrong. So
wasn't his fault.
Thank you. Am I pardoned?
Yes.
Okay. So just two more questions, and I think we'll call it a night. What do you believe is the biggest threat to the United States?
Wow. About five things came to mind, but ultimately, I think the biggest threat is just the growing divisiveness of the country. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that I could not. I mean, if I sat here and thought about it for an hour, I might come up with, everything from, increasing secularization. I can think of 100 things, but if you ask me, kind of what bothers me the most is this increasing divisiveness and this sense of, like I said, not just that we disagree, but that you're wrong. Like, this is an incredible number. 1 in 6 Americans has somebody, and this is actually 2 years ago data, so I bet the number's up since then, has a close friend or family member that they no longer talk to since the 2016 election. Okay, 1 in 6 Americans, think about that. A close friend or family member that they don't talk to anymore since the 2016 election. That can't be good.
Right.
And I'm afraid we're just continuing that path. And as I said, there's political gain to be made and money to be made in kind of this politics of opposition.
Mm-hmm. Final question is, what is the single best piece of advice you've received?
Man, this is a hard one. I might come back to the Howard Baker quote of the other fellow might be right. And I'm afraid when I say that, you all, the parents, well, this guy's just this mushy guy that kind of is going to go with whatever. But it's not that at all. But I do think we have to start with this idea of, am I out for my answer or am I out for the best answer? And I typically found out that my answer wasn't necessarily the best answer. And usually even my very best ideas were made better by somebody else. So I don't say that in a sense, I want to be really clear. I believe there's such a thing as truth. I believe there's certain principles that we need to be really strong on. But I also think we have to realize that kind of in our own brokenness and sinfulness, there's a decent chance. I mean, like I said, if I'm right 51% of the time, I'll take it.
Exactly. I suspect you're right more than that. But folks, join me in thanking Governor Haslam.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. I have a coin for you.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, now I owe you a drink since I don't have one for you.
There you go.